All right, Emily, what's your point today?
All right. Well, I want to talk about a cost of thriving index, a really interesting project that was released on Monday or Tuesday by American Compass, a right of center think tank that sort of seeks to shake off the old Republican economic orthodoxy, the sort of free market dogmatism, and propose some ideas that would actually help working class Americans, even if they make the Republican Party kind of uncomfortable. They do a lot of really great work. And I think the cost of thriving index is one example of that and well worth talking about. So instead of relying on simple inflation calculations to try to measure what has changed between earlier decades of the 20th century and now, one of those things that's been hard for people to kind of put their finger on, instead of just using that simple inflation metric, they came up with this cost of thriving index, which takes a ratio of nominal costs to nominal wages. Right, so the cost of thriving index uses a ratio of nominal costs to nominal wages instead of just relying on simple inflation. So you can see that the index then has gone up just an incredible amount since 1985 to 2022. You have about $18,000 and then a median weekly income of $443. That's for your 24-year-old full-time worker versus your annual expenses of $75,000 in 2022, along with a weekly income of about $1,200 in 2022. So you can compare that to 1985 and look at the ratio. And the ratio is fascinating to see how that has exploded. And I really like what American Compass puts in this survey that it released, or this report that it released. It says this quote explains what economists cannot, that with all of these technological innovations and advancements, quote, something important has been lost. So Ryan, I wanted to get your take on this ratio way of finding a metric to figure out kind of something economists have had a hard time putting their finger on. What has changed for the average American, and especially for the average American family where you have, or you intend to have one kind of breadwinner, typically the man, so that you don't have these insane childcare costs, which is also more in line with people's preferences generally in polling, whether you agree with that or not. It's a hard thing that economists have had sort of nailing down. So what do you think about the ratio method?
I think that's the only reasonable way you can do it, because I think that's how people experience it on a day-to-day basis. The only other thing I would try to add in is the precarity of the situation. You know, back in the 50s and 60s and even through into the 70s, people had a sense that the life that they were living at that moment was still going to be the life that they were going to be living the next year, the year after, the year after that. And also that life would get better for their kids and for their kids' kids. And so that enabled you to then eat some of the indignities, perhaps, because you were trading it for some sense of economic security going forward. Whereas now, as you're describing, people have fallen much further behind because the costs, particularly education, healthcare, childcare, like you said, have ballooned and have outpaced wages, whereas food prices have stayed pretty steady. Like when I was in college, you were paying the same at Wendy's that you're paying now, 20 years later, but you're absolutely not paying the same for college. You're not paying the same for healthcare. You're not paying the same for housing, et cetera. And so on top of that, if you throw in the fact that you don't have any certainty that what your situation is now is going to be your situation a year from now, and you also have kind of the shredding of a social safety net, then that adds an enormous amount of anxiety to it. Because if you feel like, all right, there's some more precarity in the job market, but at least I know if I fall, I'm going to be protected. I'm going to be able to bounce back. Then you might feel a little more comfortable and maybe willing to take some risks. But if you don't feel that, then you're just going to have constant anxiety, even if the numbers are matching up for you, even if you're making ends meet. You're not sure you're going to continue to be able to do that. And as that shows, you're certainly not able to put anything away. And as housing prices you get out of control, the one access to real wealth creation for middle class people, which is people would buy a house when they're 25 years old and be in good shape 30 years later as a result. And so, Emily, my question to you would be, given this reality, what kind of policies and politics is the right willing to embrace to kind of do something about this, to do something about these runaway costs?
Well, that's why I wanted to talk about this particular index, because one of the things that the right debates sort of within itself is whether or not wages have actually stagnated. And a lot of the problem is if you're just looking at the CPI versus wages, it's just hard to put your finger on that. And so moving to this ratio formula is one of those things that can help put in very stark perspective to the sort of bespectacled, well-paid expert class in Washington, D.C., what the average American is experiencing and why there's malaise. Here are the numbers that can actually sort of put this into perspective, as opposed to having these debates about CPI, which is not, to the point you just outlined, going to be the most helpful, because you have this mismatch where prices for TVs have plummeted. I mean, it's insane how low TV prices have gone, and other electronic goods and sort of things like that, versus the skyrocketing prices of healthcare and education. So relying on something that looks more like a ratio than that just basic calculation, I think, is one of those things that hopefully can help start the process of settling that debate on the right. Because if you still don't get it, you need to, because your policy prescriptions will be way off if you don't.
I think it's important that our kind of our politics really start to measure these things, because there's that old saying, you can't fix what you don't measure. And what the things that you measure, those are the things you're able to fix. And the more you keep things kind of out of the political conversation, you make them apolitical, then they just soar. And so that's why I'm so grateful to Bernie Sanders in 2015 for kind of bringing the cost of college into the political conversation, because it wasn't really a political question before that. In other words, it wasn't something that was contested in the political arena. It was just something that people said, well, that's unfortunate. Guess we better maybe do a few tax credits here or there for middle-class people to help them afford these now $60,000 a year costs for colleges out of state. Public college is costing $50,000-$60,000, and it was Sanders coming in saying, no, this is a political question. This is a decision that we may need to make democratically, and so at least it's on the table, part of the conversation. And the same for healthcare. I feel like we're not quite there yet with housing. That it's something that gets talked about in the press all the time, but it's not really something that you see a lot of politicians proposing things that might actually get done. Build Back Better had several $100 billion going toward housing policy, but when it got stripped down to becoming the Inflation Reduction Act, it was the first thing that was just gone out of here. Yet it is so central to what is making life so difficult for 90% of people in this country. It's one of those things that, like, even the people in the top 20%, are just getting killed by it.
No, you're right. And one thing that worries me, and maybe that's why there aren't a lot of solutions proposed, because one of the things that worries me is you hit an impasse here when you look at, for instance, the relationship between subsidies of education and healthcare and the costs of both of those industries. Now, nobody's saying that has to be the case, but historically in the United States, we've seen, for instance, subsidies increase the cost of education. We've seen subsidies in some ways increase the cost of healthcare. And so if we do the same thing with housing, not all of these proposals involve subsidies, to be sure. But that's another thing that, like, you and I might disagree in some cases on whether the subsidies are responsible for the hikes. And that makes it hard for policymakers to come to an agreement on, or at least an agreement that isn't like cronyism, like we've seen in the healthcare space specifically. So that if I was to do something that might put a dent in your optimism, that's what I would say.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.